Hello. This short video is about what's commonly described as the imposter syndrome, and this is what I'm going to cover for you today. Firstly, I want to give you a definition. What do we actually mean by imposter syndrome? Secondly, I want you to get really familiar with your own imposter, how it shows up, when it shows up and why, and what happens as a result. And thirdly, we're going to look at how we can banish the imposter, or at least be aware that it's there and have some strategies to deal with it. I've also prepared a checklist for you called 9 Ways to Manage Your Imposter, which summarises the key points I'm going to share with you now. The term imposter syndrome was coined in 1978 by two clinical psychologists called Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, and they were originally studying high-achieving women. Their definition at this stage was this: that despite external evidence of their competence, those exhibiting the syndrome, the imposter syndrome, remain convinced that they're frauds and do not deserve the success they've achieved. Proof of success is dismissed as luck, as timing, or as a result of deceiving others into thinking they're more intelligent and competent than they believe themselves to be. So when we're talking about imposter syndrome, we sometimes talk about the feeling of being found out, as in, one day they'll find out that I really don't deserve to be in this position. This feeling was really familiar to me in my very first senior leadership position some years ago. I felt like I was going to be found out for a couple of reasons. One, I was working with people much older than me who had a lot more corporate experience. And secondly, they were all men and I was the only woman in this newly formed team. So I really felt like a fish out of water, which of course meant that I wasn't operating at my best or being as effective as I could be, and that's not a great place to be. It took me a long time to work through that and to find some strategies to help me be successful and still feel like me. Before that, I was simply trying to survive, which takes up a lot of energy, which I know I could have put to better use. There's really no need to struggle for as long as I did. As I mentioned earlier, the imposter syndrome is about that fear of being found out. And I talked about survival, so think about what you do to survive when you're fearful. Yet when we're fearful, what we do, of course, is spend all our time trying to protect ourselves, and that may mean that we fall into those primitive behaviours of what we know as fight, flight, freeze or appease. Now that's okay if you've got a woolly mammoth heading your way, but none of those responses is particularly helpful in a leadership role. So now we're clear what the imposter syndrome is, I want you to think about when your imposter shows up and also how it shows up. For example, you might notice it when you're in a particular meeting. It might appear when you're with a particular group of people or a certain type of person. It could be when you're about to do a presentation or going to a networking event. It could be when you've been newly promoted into a senior role, like I was, when you're having to operate at a completely different level. Or it could even be when you're thinking of applying for new roles. The next thing we need to do is to understand what sort of behaviour we then display when the imposter's in the room with us, as it were. Remember, it's likely to be one of those survival behaviours. So, for example, we may lock horns or get confrontational. We're trying to survive. We may avoid speaking up or standing up for ourselves or putting our heads above the parapet. Or we may agree to something explicitly or implicitly that actually we don't really agree with at all. Once we can recognise when our imposter shows up and how we respond, we can start to do something about it. If we want to, because it is a choice. So what I'd like you to think about now is what sort of behaviour you'd like to display instead of the behaviour that you do display. Something that will be much more helpful to you and maybe to others and those around you. Yeah, it may involve some courage or some risk, but does the end justify the means in the long term? And what is the cost to you of not changing? Only you can answer that. But before we jump into that, I just want you to be a bit creative and to give life to your imposter. What does it look like or sound like? What does it say to you? My imposter is a little monkey that looks like a gremlin, and it sits on my left shoulder. So think about the voice your imposter has, or where your imposter sits or stands. Sometimes people say, I feel it gripping my throat, or I feel it's pressing down on my chest, or it's messing with my head. Once we can identify where it is, what it's saying, how it's making us feel, we can start to change it, to do something with it. Might sound a bit crazy, but trust me, it does really work. So, what to do with my cheeky gremlin monkey that's sitting there? I can brush him off my shoulder and imagine him running out the door. And for other people, a mantra works well. So I could say something like, go away monkey, I don't need you right now, I need something else. Maybe I need a brave lion or a sleek jaguar, something like that. I like a nice animal metaphor. So changing my animal metaphor really helps me to get rid of my imposter when I need to. Sometimes it's about changing the language that your imposter is using. So if your imposter says something to you like, be quiet, don't rock the boat, don't show yourself up, maybe you can change the script for something more empowering. Another strategy is to channel a role model, and this can be somebody who does something really, really well. Let's say, for example, you can't stop blabbing when your imposter shows up, and you know that one of your colleagues is really, really good at speaking in a calm, measured way, even when you know she's under pressure. So what you can start to do is notice what she does and how she does it. Start to notice maybe how she pauses, how she carries herself, how she uses certain phrases. It's not about becoming a clone of her, but it is about learning from what she does well and using that in your own working life. And it doesn't have to be someone you know. You could channel a character from history. So those are some of the strategies that I find work really well for me and some of my clients if we want to manage or banish our imposter. Now, if you're in a leadership or management position, you may be familiar with your own imposter, but how can you help your team? The first thing any leader needs to do, of course, is to create an environment of psychological safety where people can say what they need to say and where they can challenge each other in a constructive way. Because if your people are in survival mode all the time, they're never going to do their best work, and it's quite likely they're going to be hiding things from you. They're not going to be speaking up. I do hope the ideas and tips I've shared with you today have been helpful to you, and do download the checklist. It walks you through the 9 steps you can use to manage your imposter and gives you an experiment as well. Just on a final note, I want to say something about the definition I gave you right at the beginning. When Clance and Imes revisited the work that they'd done, Pauline Clance said, you know, if I were doing this work again, I wouldn't call it the imposter syndrome. I'd call it the imposter experience, because it's something that's so familiar to many of us. So the good news is that you're not alone. Thank you so much for listening today.